to do today is really pick up on what Oriane was talking about, which is the fact that we came up with the concept of the learning labs really so that we could do two things. The first was to acknowledge the fact that the pandemic created, sort of a massively sort of challenging time for organizations. And the one thing that we knew as consultants and coaches was that we couldn't really have visibility in a true sense of what was going on unless we got groups of people together and actually talked and shared ideas and insights. And as we've sort of gone through the pandemic period and we're coming into the post-pandemic period, we've sort of regularly had these learning labs, and I've sort of been doing ones on culture sort of periodically. And what it's enabled us to do is to sort of not only sort of try and look into the present and think about the future, but also to sort of come back and cross-check what's actually happening and test whether our assumptions about how culture would develop were actually accurate, or whether things are developing in a way that we hadn't expected. And I think what is really fascinating, and as Oriane said, I actually do quite a lot of work with clients on sort of new ways of working and post-pandemic culture, is that it hasn't worked out quite as we thought it would. It's all been a bit odd. And so what I want to talk about really for the first 15 minutes is what we're actually seeing happening in client organizations. And what I think, from sort of taking a step back and doing some research, I think is actually driving some of the sort of sense of messiness that is coming with new ways of working, as well as how things are developing as well. I'm then going to have a breakout session where you get to discuss some ideas and come back to plenary, and we'll talk about those. And then I want to sort of then revisit something that I've been thinking about for a long time, which is around how organizational culture really develops. And I think this has been really highlighted and crystallized by some of the things we're seeing post-pandemic. And so we'll talk about that for a little bit and then have another breakout and another group session. The objective of today really is just to sort of, I think, act as a combination of a sort of this is what I'm seeing, and also a provocation for how leaders are thinking and how we're trying to frame new ways of working. And the provocation is, are we actually starting from the right point? Or perhaps there are other ways and other things that we should also be thinking about. So that's the structure. So I'm going to share my screen. And let's say for about 10 minutes, I'm just going to run through some content, which really is sort of a synthesis of what I've been seeing happening. And then we'll get a chance to talk about it. So when we sort of put this together, I think I sort of positioned it as what has COVID done to organizational culture? And I think that we're seeing what COVID has done to organizational culture, and also what it hasn't done to organizational culture, as organizations are starting to look to what new ways of working are actually going to shape up to be as we sort of move out of everybody working from home. And I think it's worth saying that everything I'm talking about is essentially from sort of knowledge service industry basis. This isn't about manual work or people who have to physically be in a particular location. And it's working. And I think what we're seeing a lot of is a real desire and a hunger to find a new business as usual. And so if you sort of follow any of the sort of business school literature research that's coming out, particularly, and also from consulting organizations as well, there's a real sort of hunger, appetite, and shaping of a new normal. We're in a new normal. There is a new business as usual. And I think that is more of an aspiration at the moment than a truth, because what is a new normal perhaps in January earlier this year is not the new normal now. And I think the reason we're really struggling as we think about new ways of working is that from a mindset point of view, I think the way that the shaping of the future is being approached is that it's essentially a linear process, that we're coming out of pandemic and we're going into a new way of working, which will be the way of working for the future. And that's very much a transitional mindset. But I actually think that we're in a massive period of transformation. And that actually requires a much more iterative, experimental approach. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about over the last 2 years, and again, as I said, coming back in and checking in about how culture is being impacted by what is being experienced in organizations, is that we know that we're coming out of the pandemic. We know that new ways of working are going to emerge. But what we don't know, or whether any of the dramatic changes that we experienced over the last 2 years are actually going to be kept. We don't know what we're going to go back to in terms of pre-pandemic behavior. And we don't know what changes will generally stay the test of time, whether they're new post-pandemic changes or ones that we picked up during the pandemic. And as a result of that, I think what we have to acknowledge is that the pandemic has done two things. The first is it's created a massive shift over the last 2 years in how we have thought about work. And it's been called the biggest experiment in the history of work. And I think that what that has done is it has actually created a lot of hope and optimism, but also a lot of fear, a lot of noise, and a lot of confusion. And I think something that leaders are really struggling with, and certainly in the organizations I'm working in at the moment, the biggest challenge that leaders are having to deal with is the fact that we're moving to a big transformation from leadership being essentially a relatively one-dimensional activity. So you kind of know where people are going to be. They're going to be in the office, they're going to be at home. And I think that was true even during the pandemic, to something where leaders are now being invited to lead in a much more multi-dimensional way, where people are being given choice and a sense of autonomy about where and how and where they work. But the leaders are still having to be able to deliver the targets and the things that they need to achieve in their roles as leaders and bring their teams together. But they're having to accommodate many different ways of working. And I think that from a leadership mindset point of view is proving to be very, very hard. And as a result of that, that sort of got me thinking about why is it that we're seeing leaders in particular and managers really struggling with the transition out of the pandemic into how they work with their teams and how organizations frame new ways of working. And I think looking back over the learning labs, I think we made some assumptions about a year ago that have proven to be not necessarily as accurate as we would hope them to have been. And I think what happened was that we believed that culture was changing within organizations as pandemic ways of working were being experienced. And that those changes were going to be lasting changes that would be something that would be relatively obvious to hang on to post-pandemic, and that there would be this great new way of working. And I think that for a number of reasons that I'm going to explain, those assumptions, which made complete sense a year ago, are actually not accurate. And I think that one of the reasons we're struggling a bit with new ways of working is that our mindset and assumptions, which we are approaching new ways of working with, are actually at best only partially true and at worst flawed. So what I did was I took a step back, because we started working with one client on new ways of working about a year, 18 months ago. And the way that we were approaching it just didn't seem to make sense. It didn't seem to be resonating with the leaders we were working with and helping them find the solutions they needed in the way that we would hope to. So I took a step back and I asked myself a number of questions, which predominantly were, if we were to take a step back and think about what is happening right now in organizations, are there any assumptions that we're making that are actually unhelpful, or are we missing an elephant in the room or something bigger that would help us understand what is happening in culture at the moment? And as a result of that, I kind of identified three different themes, and I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. And if you find them interesting, I've actually done some videos, little short 3-minute videos on each of the themes, and Steph will be able to let you have those. And the first one was that actually culture, in terms of changes and learnings from the pandemic, hadn't reacted in the way that we thought it had. And that actually a lot of pre-pandemic cultural norms were still very much at play, both in the way that we frame work in our minds and in the way that leaders think about work. The second is that there's just been a massive acceleration of long-term working trends, and culture just hasn't kept up with it. It's just happened too fast. And then the third, and I think this is a really important one, and this is something I see a lot of within organizations, is that because it's quite noisy, because it's not clear, and because a lot of pre-pandemic norms are being challenged, leaders are feeling a great sense of ambiguity and uncertainty. And one of the ways that they're containing that is, rather than looking at the underlying cultural drivers that are emerging, is actually just reaching for certainty as a short-term fix for the discomfort of change and transformation. So I'm going to talk through those three very briefly. So as I said, I think that, you know, the big assumption that I certainly was making, and I saw people in learning labs making, and I saw colleagues in organizations making, was that the pandemic was creating new culture as we were going through it. And so remote working, working from home, trust in productivity, even if you don't have physicality, were all things that would be lasting cultural shifts that would be sticky post-pandemic. And I think that that assumption is actually not true, or I think it's broadly not true. And I think what happened was, rather than culture keeping step with the changes that were experienced during the pandemic, the pre-pandemic cultural norms essentially responded to the pandemic imposed changes by becoming dormant and being replaced by survival behaviors or crisis norms. And so it wasn't that normal organizational culture was keeping pace with the change that was being experienced. What was actually happening was that pre-pandemic cultural norms just basically became dormant and went to sleep for 2 years. Survival norms replaced them. And now those survival norms are no longer needed. What we're actually seeing is that those pre-pandemic cultural norms are coming back into play, and they are working as unchallenged assumptions in the mindsets of leaders. And the reason that's important to kind of understand and recognize is that it's partly a mindset issue, it's partly a linguistic issue. We still talk about work very much in a physical sense because that is the cultural norm that we have. But the reality is, and this is from Microsoft survey data, which was released in March 2022, and it's in the Harvard Business Review, is what we do know is that the way that people are responding to work is changing. And that is causing disruption, because if underlying culture and underlying norms that leaders are defaulting to are not shifting as well, we are going to end up with a massive tension between what employees and teams need to make them effective in the future and what employers and what leaders are hoping will come to develop as post-pandemic cultural norms. And you're seeing this with, you know, Elon Musk saying everyone's got to go back to the office. You're seeing this with, in this data, 73% of employees want flexible working, but only 50% of leaders actually do. 50% would like people back full time. And we're also seeing that 80% of employees believe that productivity has improved, whereas only 54% of leaders believe that a team is, 54% of leaders believe that teams are less productive if they're not all in the office. And I was in a conversation recently where the default setting, the mindset of the leaders was, if we're in a tight squeeze, if something needs to get done right now, everybody comes back to the office. And it's a massive default back to pre-pandemic norms. And I really love this quote. It's by a guy called L.P. Hartley, who wrote a book called The Go-Between. And I think it's really relevant for what we're talking about. And this quote is, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And however much leaders and organizational culture is tagging back to pre-pandemic norms, those are outdated and they no longer reflect the emerging status quo of what employees need and what employees want." The second thing I think that happened, which we didn't give enough thought to, well, I think we were aware of it, but we didn't give enough thought to, is pace of change whiplash. So basically, long-term working trends have massively accelerated. And these all existed prior to the pandemic. You know, video communication, flexible working, digital transformation were all things we knew were coming, but they weren't actually given a lot of leadership investment and love, because there were other things to do. They seemed to be a little bit intangible, a little bit hard to fix down. When the pandemic hit and we had to shift to remote working very quickly, suddenly these long-term trends got a lot of love and a lot of attention. It's sort of like they were massively fertilized. We put in a watering can, but they were massively fertilized. They've grown exponentially. And even though there's a pull back from them slightly, as we come out of the pandemic, those trends are not going to go away, and they are here to stay. But organizational culture hasn't again kept pace with that. So the first point I was talking about is leadership mindset and sort of the fundamental foundations of organizational culture. This one is much more of a pull change, which is stuff is changing in the wider world and you can't put the genie back in the bottle.